The geography of the Iberian Peninsula is more sharply divided than in almost any other part of Europe, and these divisions shaped its history from the very beginning. Mountain ranges, plateaus, and isolated coastlands encouraged strong regional identities, made political unity difficult, and left coastal regions exposed to repeated waves of outside invasion. The Pyrenees formed a powerful natural barrier, cutting the peninsula off from the rest of the continent. But their influence did not end there. The mountain system continues westward under different names, creating a narrow northern coastline fed by short rivers. This region receives heavy rainfall, supports rich pasture land, and is backed by wooded mountain slopes that provided abundant timber. Its difficult access made it an ideal refuge in times of conquest, a last stronghold where local independence could survive. From this northern mountain belt, an uneven chain of ranges runs southeast toward the Mediterranean. These ranges send out three major branches to the west, dividing the river systems that drain much of western Iberia. The Douro, the Guadiana, and the Guadalquivir each flow through their own distinct basins, separated by rugged highlands. In the south, the land takes on a very different character. Rainfall is scarce except in winter, and the climate is almost subtropical. This southern zone is sharply separated from the dry, rocky plateau of Castile by the massive barrier of the Sierra Morena, where elevations rise to nearly 1,000 meters. Along the western coast, rainfall is again plentiful and vegetation dense. Yet the southwestern corner of the peninsula, though rich in mineral resources, offers poor and stony soil. Across much of Iberia, the coastal lowlands are hemmed in by mountain chains that drop sharply toward the sea, creating a landscape of narrow plains, deep valleys, and isolated peaks, while only the central plateau spreads out in broad, open expanses. Because many of the earliest inhabitants lived without writing and left few monumental remains, and because Iberia entered the awareness of Greek and Roman writers relatively late, the peninsula's earliest history remains shadowy. Archaeology has revealed traces of prehistoric settlements scattered across the land, including numerous megalithic tombs known locally as antas. These stone structures appear most frequently in what is now Portugal and were clearly burial monuments. Typically, they consist of 6 or 7 upright stones leaning inward, capped by one or more flat slabs, sometimes approached by a short, stone-lined path. Within them, stone tools and roughly shaped animal figures have occasionally been discovered. These monuments are often linked to a very early population, sometimes identified with the Cro-Magnon peoples. It has been suggested that their descendants survived in isolated rural communities in parts of southern France, and that they may have been related to the now extinct Guanches of the Canary Islands. Cave dwellings excavated in recent decades, especially in northern Iberia, may also belong to this same ancient population. One such site near Segobriga revealed the remains of 2 distinct human groups. One was clearly primitive in physical type, while the other showed signs of more advanced culture. It has been proposed that during a catastrophic flood, the latter group sought shelter in the ancient cave of their ancestors, built barriers of stone and clay in a desperate attempt to survive, and ultimately drowned. The site contained bones of cattle, deer, and other animals, along with tools made of bone and flint, a small number of copper objects, and fragments of pottery coated in dark red or grey slips. Another extraordinary site lies near Santander, where the cave of Altamira preserves one of the most remarkable collections of prehistoric art ever discovered. Here, worked flints and bones were found alongside vivid paintings of animals rendered in red and black, highlighted with white outlines and spread across the ceilings of the cave chambers. None of the animals depicted appear to have been domesticated. Instead, they represent species that would have been hunted, including the massive wild cattle of ancient Europe. These images may have been created as ritual objects intended to ensure the abundance of game. Human figures also appear, some wearing animal masks, a practice associated with ritual performance and religious ceremony, customs that survived in parts of Iberia well into later historical periods. By the time Roman forces entered the peninsula during the Second Punic War, Iberia was home to a mosaic of peoples, both indigenous and foreign. Political organization was typically local and tribal. Authority appeared monarchic on the surface, but in practice rested with assemblies of elders or nobles. In the south and southeast lived the Tartessians, later known as the Tur de Tani, along with closely related groups. They stood out as one of the most advanced societies in the Western Mediterranean, possessing written traditions, historical memory, extensive trade networks, and highly developed skills in metalworking and sculpture. Some scholars have speculated that they preserved fragments of an older Bronze Age civilization with roots stretching across the Mediterranean, though their true origins remain debated. What is clear is that early Greek writers consistently distinguished them from the Iberians, noting differences in language, burial practices, and seafaring ability. The eastern and northern regions of the peninsula were inhabited by Iberian tribes. Those near the coast showed signs of greater development, while communities farther inland remained largely tribal, relying on hunting or raiding for survival. Much of the central interior, including large parts of what later became Castile, as well as sections of Aragon and Murcia, was occupied by Celtiberian peoples. These groups emerged from the blending of Celtic migrants from beyond the Pyrenees, with the Iberians already living there, likely several centuries before Roman arrival. In the far northwest and along parts of the upper Guadiana basin, lived other Celtic communities that appear to have remained less mixed with neighbouring populations. The ancestors of the modern Euskara-speaking peoples remain one of the most debated elements of Iberian history. They were not the Vascones of Roman records, despite the later association of the name. Instead, they seem to have formed part of the population of the Cantabrian region, largely absent from historical narratives. Their language was so unlike anything familiar to ancient geographers that recorded place names vanish as those writers moved into their territory. In the south, small Phoenician settlements dotted the coast, while in the northeast a handful of Greek colonies established trading outposts. These diverse populations have given rise to countless theories, particularly regarding the origins of the Basques. Since the 19th century, they have been variously described as survivors of an ancient European population, migrants from Africa, remnants of a lost continent, or relatives of distant peoples from northern Europe, or even the Americas. Their language, highly agglutinative and long unwritten, their physical appearance and their persistence in ancient customs have all fueled speculation. Most scholars agree that they represent the survival of an extremely ancient population. But whether they are a specialized branch of the Iberians or a people who preceded them and were driven into the mountains remains unresolved. Until the inscriptions of the ancient Iberian language are fully understood, the relationship between Iberian and modern Basque will remain uncertain. What is beyond doubt is that the Iberians themselves once occupied a far wider territory, extending into southern Gaul, maintaining ties with communities in Sicily, and even leaving traces among the ancient peoples of Western Britain. The modern population of Spain appears strikingly unified, and beneath regional differences lies a shared physical heritage rooted in the Mediterranean world. Long, narrow skulls, elongated faces, dark brown hair, relatively broad noses, and a generally modest stature define this population. These traits closely match ancient descriptions of the Iberians, recorded by Roman observers, and align with the physical features still common in southern Italy, Sicily, Liguria, Provence, and parts of North Africa. The same underlying characteristics can also be traced beneath much of the population often labelled as Celtic across Western Europe. The arrival of Celtic groups in Iberia likely began around the 6th century, before the Common Era. Earlier Mediterranean writers make no mention of them, yet by the time of Greek historians, they are already established in the far west. This coincided with the height of Celtic expansion, when their influence stretched across Gaul into much of Central Europe and down into northern Italy. Although their origin lay beyond the Pyrenees, their movement into Iberia probably followed the sea rather than overland routes, as both sides of the mountain chain were already occupied by Iberian-speaking peoples. Their earliest foothold appears to have been in the northwestern coastal regions, from which they advanced southward along the Atlantic shoreline and later inland through parts of Lusitania and the Guadiana Basin. After prolonged conflict, these newcomers gradually merged with the Iberian populations of the Central Plateau. Celtic society in Iberia was largely pastoral. Villages were preferred over cities, and the population remained scattered across wide areas. This dispersion made it difficult for Celtic cultural identity to remain distinct. Over time, older Iberian traditions reasserted themselves. Western tribes pushed Celtic groups back toward the interior, while Iberian communities consolidated control of the far southwest. By the Roman period, little remained of Celtic influence beyond certain place names, a handful of religious practices, and minor linguistic variations. Long before foreign colonies appeared along the coast, Phoenician merchants had become familiar figures in southern Iberia, drawn by the peninsula's mineral wealth. Their settlements are difficult to trace precisely because they rarely founded cities from scratch. Instead, they embedded themselves within existing Iberian or Tartessian towns, operating as commercial communities, rather than colonial populations. The earliest clearly Phoenician foundation was the port of Gades, established more than a millennium before the Common Era. Other trading centres followed along the southern and eastern shores. Many towns later described as Punic were in fact native communities that prospered through sustained contact with Phoenician traders, who introduced writing systems, religious imagery, and coinage. As Phoenicia fell under the control of successive Eastern empires, the fortunes of its western outposts declined. Greek traders strengthened their presence along the eastern coast. Celtic pressure increased from the west, and local rulers turned against Phoenician dominance. Faced with mounting threats, the people of Gades sought help from their powerful relatives across the sea in North Africa. The result was a dramatic transformation. Warriors from Carthage, hardened by generations of conflict, took control of southern Iberia. Older fortifications were dismantled, rival settlements subdued, and even Greek communities temporarily overrun. Before long, Carthage controlled much of the peninsula, recruiting native soldiers and exploiting mineral resources on an unprecedented scale. This dominance intensified after Carthage's defeat in Sicily forced it to rely heavily on Iberian wealth. Central regions were brought under control, eastern ports were closed to foreign traders, and Spain became a crucial supplier of manpower, horses, and silver. A massive military and naval base rose on the southeastern coast, while outposts spread to nearby islands and strategic headlands. This system collapsed during the war against Rome. By the early 2nd century before the Common Era, Carthaginian garrisons had been expelled, and many Punic cities willingly accepted Roman authority in exchange for protection and internal autonomy. Despite lingering religious imagery on coins, Physical traces of Phoenician settlement remained surprisingly scarce, suggesting that merchant networks, rather than mass migration, defined their presence. Greek contact with Iberia began earlier and followed a different path. The first Iberian city to enter Greek awareness was the capital of the Tartessian realm, visited by seafarers from Asia Minor during the early Iron Age. Its ruler welcomed them warmly, even providing financial aid to support their distant homeland. Subsequent voyages brought further contact, including one accidental arrival that resulted in lucrative trade. As Phoenician and Etruscan naval power weakened, Greek influence expanded. Artistic styles, religious practices, and commercial ties linked Iberia to the wider Greek world. Colonies from the western Greek city of Massilia played a central role. Near the eastern Pyrenees, a trading settlement was established that grew into a mixed city where Greek and native communities lived side by side before eventually blending into a single population. The town prospered through textile production and agriculture and became a regional centre of worship and trade. Smaller Greek stations dotted the coast further south, most functioning as commercial hubs rather than political centres. These settlements integrated deeply with local societies and left few traces of independent cultural production, but their presence helped stabilise trade and introduced Mediterranean institutions to the eastern seaboard. Greek control was temporarily disrupted during Carthaginian expansion. Some settlements disappeared entirely, while others survived under foreign domination. Treaties with Rome restored their independence, and conflict over one strategically important city sparked the war that ended Carthaginian rule in Iberia. Ancient writers also believed Greek traders had ventured along the distant northwestern coast. Although legends blurred history with myth, archaeological and linguistic traces suggest that limited Greek contact may indeed have reached these shores, driven by the search for tin and coastal trade routes. Over time, knowledge of Iberia spread gradually through the Greek world. Early writers recorded only coastal names, but later scholars produced increasingly accurate descriptions of the land, its peoples, and its resources. Some even lived for years in Iberian cities, studying local customs, economy, and geography firsthand. Their accounts shaped how Spain was understood throughout the Roman world. Alongside factual descriptions, Iberia attracted myths. As the edge of the known world, it became a setting for heroic journeys and divine adventures. Gods, heroes, and legendary founders were said to have walked its shores. Even in late antiquity, writers continued to weave imaginative tales around its landscapes, mines, and distant islands. When Roman forces replaced Carthage as the dominant power, they inherited a land of sharp contrasts. The south and east possessed developed agriculture, active trade, writing, coinage, and urban life. The interior remained thinly settled and economically limited. The northern and western regions were largely untouched by Mediterranean civilization, their inhabitants relying on herding, hunting, and raiding. The early decades of Roman rule were turbulent. Revolts broke out repeatedly, Roman armies suffered defeats, and resentment spread even among once compliant communities. The Republic faced a vast challenge. It needed to unify fragmented regions, integrate isolated towns into a broader political framework, develop underused land, and pacify fiercely independent mountain peoples. Pure military force proved insufficient. Gradually, more effective strategies emerged. Roads were built, mines reopened, and mixed settlements of Italians and natives encouraged. Local autonomy was preserved where possible, easing resentment and stabilizing governance. Permanent garrisons secured key coastal centers, while selected colonies were established to anchor Roman authority. These measures did not immediately transform Iberia, but they laid the groundwork for deeper integration. The peninsula was no longer a distant frontier, but an essential part of the Mediterranean world, poised on the threshold of profound change. The end of Viriathus marked a turning point in Rome's long struggle for control of Western Iberia. By around 140 BCE, the people who had supported his resistance were finally overcome, bringing down one of the toughest opponents Rome ever faced on the peninsula. After this, Roman commanders began to look beyond the familiar theatres of war toward the harsher, less accessible lands of the northwest. An early effort to pressure these communities followed under a Roman leader campaigning deep into that region, though the full reduction of the far northwest would only be completed much later, in the age of Caesar and Augustus. Not long after, another dramatic milestone reshaped the balance of power. The fall of Numantia in 133 BCE, achieved through a methodical siege led by a Roman commander of exceptional reputation, completed the conquest of the Celtiberian heartland. From that point forward, resistance did not vanish, but it changed shape. Some groups still fought as raiders or bandits, striking where the land allowed. But large-scale organised opposition to Roman expansion weakened in a visible way. What followed was not simply conquest, but a slow absorption. Roman habits, Roman language, and Roman administrative methods began to spread so deeply that Iberia soon became more than a conquered territory. It became a stage on which Rome's own internal struggles would play out. That shift can be seen clearly in the career of Sertorius. Driven into exile during Rome's political storms, he turned Iberia into the base for an alternative Roman order. His power rested on alliances with hard-fighting local peoples, especially Lusitanians and Celtiberians, while Roman officers provided discipline, organization, and bureaucratic structure. The result was a striking demonstration for inland communities, who had once known Rome only as an invading army. Two major provincial centres were organised with functioning capitals, a political council that mirrored Roman institutions, and even a school designed to teach Latin and Greek to local elites. Mines, arsenals, and a naval force supported this system, making it feel less like a temporary rebellion and more like a competing version of Rome itself. Latin spread quickly under these conditions, and familiarity with Roman administration helped explain why, after Sertorius fell, many of his former supporters transitioned into the standard provincial framework, with less reluctance than might be expected after decades of war. The broader policy of winning loyalty through settlement and managed integration continued under Caesar and later under Augustus. Yet constant civil conflict across the Roman world repeatedly disrupted efforts to stabilize Iberia. Lasting pacification and orderly organization did not truly take firm shape until Augustus had been in power for years and could concentrate resources without the peninsula being pulled into fresh Roman power struggles. Caesar's connection to Spain was unusually deep. He fought there in 4 major campaigns, 2 of them against fellow Romans during civil war. Even so, his actions had lasting consequences beyond the battlefield. He weakened Celtic groups in the northwest and pushed Roman reach into territories that had long remained distant and difficult to control, opening routes by both land and sea. He also pursued a more systematic colonial strategy, planting settlements for veterans and citizens in order to secure key regions and reshape the political landscape. These colonies were concentrated especially in the south, in the prosperous region later known for its wealth and urban life. The reason was political as well as practical. In the civil wars, many communities there had leaned towards Caesar's opponents, and defeat brought confiscations and redistribution of land. At the same time, citizenship was extended widely in varying degrees to communities considered stable, cooperative, or strategically useful. Where Caesar's plans remained unfinished at his death, later leaders confirmed and carried them forward. One major southern city was refounded as a Roman colony, setting it on a path that would later make it one of the peninsula's most important urban centres. Yet the clearest window into Caesar's municipal design comes from a legal charter preserved for a smaller town nearby. After siding with Caesar's enemies, it was reorganized through confiscation and resettlement, with Roman civilians installed to anchor loyalty. The charter lays out an entire civic machine in careful detail. The responsibilities of the chief magistrates, the authority of the local council, voting procedures in the public assembly, and the roles of officials extending down into ceremonial and religious functions. One clause is especially revealing about the time. Local leaders could, by majority decision, authorize the arming of citizens and even resident outsiders if a threat arose. Such a measure would only make sense in a province still considered insecure, where sudden attack remained plausible. Later, as the southern province became more settled and was governed without standing troops, the practical importance of this rule would fade, even if similar provisions remained relevant farther north where unrest and surprise raids were more likely. Spain's provincial structure had taken shape earlier, in 197 BCE, when Rome shifted from sending special commanders to establishing a more regular provincial system. The peninsula was divided into two broad administrations, a nearer province and a farther province, each governed by a Roman magistrate, with headquarters placed at key urban centres. Borders changed over time, but the nearer province gradually expanded. By Caesar's era, it included most of Iberia, except the southern heartland and the western Atlantic zone that would later be more clearly separated. Even before official reorganization under Augustus, the reality of regional difference was already recognized by Roman commanders, who divided responsibilities among deputies according to geography and political conditions. Once Caesar had subdued much of the west, only a few areas remained fully outside Roman control. The most stubborn were the mountain peoples of the far northwest, especially groups known for fierce resistance and for living in terrain that favoured ambush and long wars. Another sensitive frontier lay near the Pyrenees, where communities had recently fought alongside the peoples north of the mountains against Roman expansion. In the decade leading up to Augustus's final settlement of the peninsula, a series of Roman commanders celebrated victories in that northern belt, while pressure beyond the Pyrenees forced neighbouring groups to submit as well. The final conquest of the mountain zones required brutal, sustained campaigning. Augustus took personal direction at times, and later entrusted major operations to his most capable lieutenants. The goal was not simply to win battles, but to break the capacity for renewed revolt. Large numbers were killed or enslaved. Others were forcibly moved down from the highlands into flatter districts, where Roman troops and colonies could monitor them more easily. Around them, a chain of veteran settlements was planted, sometimes placed deliberately on or near older native sites. These colonies served as permanent garrisons and also as instruments of economic extraction and cultural change. Across the northwest and interior, new Roman-founded towns appeared as anchors of control and administration. In the far northwest, settlements rose that would become enduring urban centres. In a rugged region near the Atlantic, another major colony was established that quickly attracted rural estates and functioned as a launching point for Roman customs, later growing into one of the most important towns of the West. In the interior south and west, additional colonies were founded on strategic rivers and routes, tying together frontier control with agriculture, taxation, and recruitment. In the northeast, an older native settlement on the Ebro was transformed into a major administrative and legal centre, eventually developing into a city famous in later centuries. for its position and surroundings. In the southern province, another colony grew into a leading town, described by later Roman observers as second only to the greatest regional capitals. Even where allied towns kept formal autonomy, Roman practice often undermined that independence indirectly. Small military stations were placed nearby, drawing population, commerce, and influence away from older centres. On the Atlantic coast, such a foundation helped create the nucleus of a port that later became world famous, as wealthier inhabitants relocated toward the safer and more Roman-aligned settlement. Over time, the combined name of the port and the older locality produced the name that would define an entire country. Meanwhile, many inland towns declined, not because they were destroyed, but because the new Roman road network bypassed them, shifting trade and travel toward corridors Rome could control. As the empire stabilized, colony foundations increasingly took on a military character. Civilian settlements like those established in late Republican times became rarer, replaced by veteran colonies designed to secure territory and support garrisons. A major administrative redesign followed under Augustus. After the Northern Wars, the former broad southern province was divided into a senatorial province and an imperial province, each with its own capital and administrative structure. Their territorial extent was initially larger than it would be later, reaching beyond the limits familiar from the mature empire. Yet military realities forced further adjustments. The far northwest was detached and placed under the wider northern administration so that key military zones could be coordinated under a single command. Even so, special military oversight persisted, with separate officers responsible for frontier districts, an early sign of the distinct security problems that would later justify creating a more independent provincial structure in that region. In the southern senatorial province, the governor relied on a financial official to manage revenues destined for Rome, and on a deputy based in the secondary capital to assist with administration. In the western imperial province, the governor had limited military resources and depended more on local stability than on legions. The largest northern province, controlled directly by the emperor, became the true military backbone of Roman Spain. Its governor fixed headquarters at the major northeastern capital on the Mediterranean, sometimes visiting older centres, but choosing his main base according to strategy, distance from Rome, and the need to respond quickly to threats from the north and west. He operated with several deputies and commanded 3 legions. One deputy with supporting units held the far northwest beyond the Douro. Another, backed by a legion, watched the mountain corridor below the Pyrenees. A third oversaw the interior zones around the Ebro and the old Celtiberian lands. By then, Iberia had been reshaped into a province not merely conquered, but managed, organised, and increasingly integrated into the machinery of the Roman world. The cost of that transformation was immense, but its result was a peninsula bound into Rome's political system. Its frontiers guarded by soldiers, its towns governed by charters, and its long history of fragmented resistance gradually pushed into the background. From the earliest decades of the empire, the Roman legions based in Spain came to rely overwhelmingly on local manpower. Recruitment was drawn mainly from the provinces themselves, especially from the regions closest to the garrisons. While the wealthy south, much like Italy in the same period, contributed comparatively few soldiers. Alongside the legions, Rome also raised many auxiliary units among communities known for toughness and martial tradition. Some of these auxiliary cohorts stayed on the peninsula, but large numbers were sent far away, serving in frontier armies along the Danube and the Rhine, and later appearing in growing numbers in Britain. Inscriptions from that island repeatedly mention Spanish detachments, both mounted and on foot, evidence that Iberian recruits had become a familiar part of Rome's military machine across the empire. Within Spain itself, coastal security could not be ignored. The eastern shoreline faced periodic raids by pirates crossing from North Africa, and protection there relied in part on locally raised militia. This force operated under its own command structure, with its leading officer based at Tarraco. Earlier in the century, similar locally organised cohorts had been used in major southern cities, and comparable formations existed in other strategic points as well. Spanish soldiers were valued enough that, for a time, Augustus even selected men from the peninsula to serve in his personal guard at Rome, a sign that Iberian recruits were viewed as both reliable and formidable. Military service also became a practical tool of administration. For poorer, remote communities where regular taxation was difficult to collect, enlistment could function as an alternative to tribute. Rome pursued a clear objective: crush resistance, then draw the strongest and most capable men into Roman service, turning potential enemies into instruments of imperial stability. As long as the empire could hold its borders, this approach worked. Many of the most warlike highland peoples of the north were drafted away from their home districts and dispersed across distant provinces. When their service ended, land was often granted not near their original communities, but far away, reducing the chance that veterans would return home and rebuild local resistance. Those who served in legions stationed within Spain became bound to the unit's internal discipline and identity, a powerful force that helped restrain rebellion even when the ranks were largely non-Italian. For centuries, Spain remained notably loyal. Yet there was an unintended consequence. When imperial authority eventually weakened, the peninsula lacked the habit or structure of independent national defence. The provinces, long protected by imperial systems, found themselves unable to coordinate resistance when new waves of invaders arrived. Under Augustus, 3 legions formed the backbone of Spain's military presence. 2 were positioned in Asturia and 1 in Cantabria, with smaller detachments scattered elsewhere as needed. This arrangement made the northern imperial province unusual. It was not a border province facing a foreign power, yet it still required full legions because the threat lay within rugged terrain and among recently subdued peoples. Over the following decades, the distribution shifted. 1 legion was moved northward to reinforce the Rhine frontier under Claudius. The remaining forces, along with a newly organised legion brought into the system, continued to serve in Spain into the late 1st century. During the rule of the Flavian emperors, the garrison was steadily reduced, first from 3 legions to 2, then down to a single legion supported by auxiliary troops. That final arrangement endured for a very long time, lasting until the age of Diocletian. The Asturian forces were based in the interior, between important northern centres, close to a later military camp that eventually grew into the city of Leon. The Cantabrian legion was stationed at a northern strongpoint near the coastal approaches. Surprisingly little is recorded about spectacular operations carried out by these troops. Their work was often quiet and repetitive rather than dramatic, and sometimes units were temporarily reassigned to other provinces. Yet their long-term impact was significant. They suppressed brigandage and made regular life safer. In the early years of Augustus's rule, farming in certain western districts was still described as dangerous. A writer only half a century later could observe that regions once perpetually disturbed by war were now so calm that even banditry was no longer a serious problem. The government nevertheless continued to cultivate loyalty among settled communities, and a public oath preserved from the early 1st century shows citizens in one western town formally pledging to treat the emperor's enemies as their own. For all this, Spain did not maintain a permanent naval force. Even though campaigns had shown how valuable sea power could be for controlling distant coasts, no standing war fleet was kept in the region. The weakness became noticeable later when raiders from North Africa began striking parts of the southern shoreline more frequently. One of the clearest measures of how quickly Roman order spread across Spain comes from a census summary associated with the age of Augustus. It reveals the speed with which an urban framework expanded, replacing older, looser political structures, whose kings vanish from the record almost without explanation. In the great northern province, hundreds of named communities were counted. A large portion already possessed a defined civic status, whether as colonies, municipally organized towns, Latin rights communities, allied towns, or tributary towns. The rest lacked a true city centre but still held recognised territory and limited self-government. Many of these names echoed earlier tribal identities, suggesting that Roman administrators were reshaping older units into something closer to the village and district structures familiar in Italy, units that could later be elevated if they became sufficiently settled and Romanized. In the southern province, the urban network was even denser. Though far smaller in area than the northern province, it contained an extraordinary number of towns, including multiple colonies and many communities holding intermediate legal privileges. The western province showed fewer communities overall, but even there, several colonies and privileged towns anchored Roman authority. Yet not every region fit neatly into the system. Some remote peoples were left outside it altogether. Others were so scattered across villages that they were administratively attached to a central town which handled local government, taxation, and legal affairs on their behalf. Some districts were managed through temporary or transitional arrangements, with leadership titles that suggest experimentation and uneven development. In a few particularly backward zones, administration could even be placed in the hands of outsiders, tied to Italy's social and economic networks. Old forms did not vanish overnight. In some areas, remnants of earlier collective landholding or local leagues continued under new names and legal shapes. Even so, the broad effect was unmistakable. A landscape of scattered communities, each with its own degree of rights, and often containing some Italian element, quickly accustomed provincial populations to Roman legal practice. Where municipal habits already existed among the more settled Iberian groups, Roman administrators did not erase them, but refined them, steering them into recognizable Roman frameworks. The transformation also worked on a wider scale than individual towns. Judicial districts, which had developed in the late Republic and were reorganized under Augustus, became another tool for overriding older ethnic boundaries. Smaller communities were grouped around major centers that acted as hubs for courts and administration, and individuals often identified themselves through these regional affiliations. Several such judicial districts existed in the northern province, and others in the southern and western provinces as well, forming a mesh of administrative geography laid over the peninsula's older tribal map. The timing of citizenship grants and legal promotions is not always easy to trace precisely, but the overall direction is clear. Augustus continued and expanded a long-term project, raising the central and northern districts to a more urban, Romanized level, closer to that already seen in the south and along the eastern seaboard. Town governments increasingly resembled those of Italy. Local magistrates were elected. Councils met in formal sessions. Popular assemblies existed in structured forms, and officials assessed property in order to determine tax responsibilities. Local taxes were not generally crushing, but civic office carried prestige, and prestige created expectations. Office holders were often willing to spend heavily for public benefit, funding buildings, festivals, and distributions. Wealthy freedmen, who frequently dominated trade and local business, were also drawn into this civic culture through honorary orders and public responsibilities designed to turn private wealth into municipal advantage. The evidence for this civic generosity survives in countless inscriptions. Again and again, individuals appear not simply as private citizens, but as public benefactors. One town commemorated a citizen who brought in a water supply across exceptionally difficult terrain and organised grain relief when food prices soared. Elsewhere, a soldier left a large sum to be invested so that the annual interest would fund public entertainment and supplies for communal baths, while also protecting his household from certain local burdens. Another benefactor provided a much larger endowment, with the income distributed among citizens according to rank on the donor's birthday. In a major southern city, a citizen set up an annual support payment for children being raised at public expense. In such a world, prosperity carried obligations, and status was measured not only by what a person owned, but by what that person gave back. A structure existed that might have grown into something like a provincial federal system if it had been strengthened further: the Provincial Assembly. These councils met annually to honour the imperial cult in a chief city, guided by a presiding provincial priest. In Spain, there is no clear sign that these gatherings grew out of older native religious federations. They appear more like institutions encouraged from above. The earliest known assembly met at Tarraco early in the 1st century at a shrine dedicated to the deified Augustus. Similar gatherings later appeared in the southern and western capitals. Deputies could be sent from colonies and towns with higher legal status, typically chosen by local councils, with their costs paid from municipal funds. These assemblies elected their presiding official, selected provincial patrons, sent delegations to the emperor, expressed thanks for good governors, and could support accusations against abusive ones. Their authority remained ambiguous. Technically, they functioned as private bodies operating with official approval, rather than as full governmental institutions. They did not control coinage in Spain, though they could commission statues and strike commemorative medallions. At times, emperors addressed them collectively, and surviving correspondence shows that advice and directives could flow through this channel. When governors were prosecuted for misconduct, proceedings usually began with instructions from individual cities to their own representatives, and trials were commonly held before the Senate in earlier periods, shifting more often toward the emperor's advisory circle as the Senate's political role declined. During the instability of the 3rd century, such assemblies fade from view only to reappear later in a more secular form, with their presiding official taking on mainly civic duties and, on rare occasions, even being a Christian. Financial administration in the empire gradually became more regular than in the chaotic Republican era. Under Augustus, Spain was drawn into a system broadly similar to that used elsewhere. When managed fairly, it does not appear to have produced widespread resentment. Most towns paid fixed tribute, assessed locally according to property and collected by municipal officials, then transferred to provincial financial officers. Taxes included land dues, charges on auctions, inheritance taxes that affected citizens under Roman law, and customs duties levied at entry and exit points. Spain formed a single customs region, and the rate was lower than in many provinces, a policy that encouraged commerce rather than suffocating it. Trade was also supported by infrastructure. Road building expanded dramatically under Augustus, building on earlier routes already in use. One major highway, partly older than Roman rule but fully measured, repaired and marked with milestones under Roman administration, ran along the Mediterranean side through key coastal centres. Augustus improved and redirected sections of it, extended branches toward the great southern capitals and incorporated earlier segments built under Caesar. Another vital route ran from Tarraco toward the northwest, linking rising colonial centres that became major administrative and commercial nodes. A separate entry corridor crossed the western Pyrenees, connecting Atlantic Gaul to a key town just south of the mountains, while major junction cities in the west and southeast acted as hubs where multiple routes converged. Main roads were planned by the government for military movement and trade. Secondary roads were built by municipalities, sometimes cooperatively by several towns at once. Nearby communities were required to keep these routes in repair and to support the imperial postal system. As security improved and traffic increased, villages grew up along these highways, often founded through grants of public land meant to encourage settlement, stabilize travel, and multiply internal commerce. Across the 1st century, this new geography of roads, towns, and privileges slowly reshaped the peninsula. Population and wealth increasingly concentrated in a smaller number of large centres, many of them in the south and west. Older towns, including several once famous communities of the interior and the Ebro Valley, gradually shrank. Legal reforms that elevated many southern towns may have accelerated this trend, strengthening regions already dense with urban life, while leaving some older inland centres to fade from prominence. Augustus's settlement brought a long, rare calm to the peninsula. Peace became the default condition, and local administration grew more consistent from one region to another. Yet this was not a later, rigid kind of uniformity. Local habits were not crushed or erased. Instead, Rome relied on a framework that matched the instincts of Iberian life. Power was anchored in the town and the village, not in large tribal structures. For many communities, the township mattered more than any wider canton or ethnic label. The local pueblo, governed by its elected magistrate and council, supported by shared storehouses and communal land, functioned as the natural unit of society. Narrow local loyalties were strong, and broader national unity was weak. That suited Roman methods perfectly. A policy of dividing authority among many small communities, each with its own obligations and privileges, fit the peninsula's political temperament. In other regions, especially in Gaul, the situation was different. There, tribal identity was stronger and harder to ignore, and Roman organization often had to preserve tribal structures by turning major towns into the formal capitals of distinct peoples. Across the southern and central parts of Spain, Latin gradually became the everyday language of public life. Roman dress, especially the toga, spread even into Celtiberian districts, and was sometimes adopted by non-citizens as a visible signal of loyalty. Over time, older local customs and rougher religious practices retreated in many areas before a more polished Mediterranean urban culture. Even so, the older speech of the peninsula did not vanish. It slowly withdrew from official inscriptions and administrative use, but it survived among ordinary people for generations, leaving a deep imprint that later resurfaced inside the major Romance languages of Iberia. At the same time, Rome did not absorb Spain in a one-sided way. Native energy and talent shaped the empire in return. Spain produced writers whose influence reached Rome itself and helped redirect Latin literature into a new phase. Soldiers from the peninsula became famous for endurance and skill, and carried weapons and fighting methods that impressed Roman commanders. Spaniards also rose into positions of authority at court and in the highest circles of power. Within a few decades of Augustus's death, a man of Spanish origin could effectively steer the empire during a crisis. Within about a century, another Spanish ruler could be regarded as one of the most capable heirs to the Augustan tradition. As the central peninsula of Italy weakened over time, Spain's importance increased. While Italy became crowded with court dependents and populations shaped by servitude and patronage, Spain increasingly served as a stable support for imperial strength. Yet, stability depended on good government. When administration became exploitative and municipal life was damaged, the consequences were severe. Communities that had once thrived under local civic pride could be hollowed out by misrule, creating a society heavier with slavery, poverty, and lawlessness. Under those conditions, the later arrival of foreign peoples could be welcomed not as conquerors, but as liberators, simply because the provincial population had grown desperate. Even with centuries of Roman presence, the deeper character of the population remained remarkably persistent. In many conquered regions, older local groups tend to reassert themselves within a few generations, partly because they are better adapted to the land, and partly because their communities are anchored by families and continuity. The number of immigrants from Italy, whether merchants, investors, or veterans, was never large enough to permanently reshape a population that ancient observers believed to be enormous. Spain would later absorb powerful Germanic newcomers and still retain a recognizable identity. It could also assimilate, or in some cases reject, large populations arriving from Africa and the eastern Mediterranean. The long-term pattern suggests that the peninsula could accept new layers without losing its core. For roughly 80 years after Augustus's settlement, external events in Spain were relatively quiet. Citizenship did not spread as widely as might be expected, partly because the empire faced continual demands for soldiers, and partly because many recruitment needs could not easily be met inside fully citizen communities. Yet quiet did not mean justice. Under Tiberius, the list of harsh governors grew. One official, remembered for cruelty that pushed a province toward revolt, was condemned and exiled by the Roman Senate, and his replacement managed to calm tensions. Another administrator in the Great Northern Province was accused of severe oppression, yet the emperor refused to offer redress. In the end, the man was killed by a labourer, one more example of political violence that appears again and again in Spanish history. In the same climate, a wealthy Spaniard living in Rome became the target of a hostile prosecution. He was executed, and his lucrative mines passed into state hands. Others suffered as well, including respected local figures imprisoned on charges that reflected the paranoia of the age and the fear that loyalty might shift from the emperor to the state. During the reign of Caligula, unrest reached even the imperial inner circle through conspiracy, and a man from the south of Spain was implicated and executed. Under Claudius, at least one reform was introduced that provincials valued. A delay was imposed between successive governorships, held by the same individual, so that complaints could be investigated before a man moved on to another post. Statues rose in Claudius's honour across Spain, though corruption and influence often limited the practical effect of the measure. Around the same time, work was done to open a major route through Lusitania, part of a continuing effort to tighten administration through roads and communication. This was also an age when the cultural life of southern Spain left a strong mark on Rome. Education in Latin rhetoric and literature flourished, and several prominent writers, teachers, and orators emerged from the region. Their careers reveal a society no longer merely provincial, but fully engaged with the intellectual life of the empire. Under Nero, however, the system again showed strain. Financial agents grew more exploitative, and unrest flared in the north among peoples who had been forced into submission earlier but never truly integrated. Signs of disaffection appeared even in island territories off the coast, where special officers were appointed, hinting that security concerns had returned. One governor in the north gained a reputation for strict justice. He resisted predatory officials and checked corruption among administrators, and accountants. It was in a northern town that he learned of Nero's death. After convening an assembly of local notables in a way that had not been seen before, he made the decision to move against Italy and claim the imperial throne. The large military force under his control in Spain made that gamble possible. Yet his short reign brought heavier taxation and numerous executions in Spain, showing how quickly power struggles at the top could translate into suffering at the provincial level. His successor, once a governor in the West, introduced measures that benefited provincial communities, expanding certain cities and distributing citizenship more freely. Revenue from coastal towns across the strait in North Africa was also attached to southern Spain for a time, reflecting the practical reality that the western Mediterranean shores often had more in common across the water than they did with distant inland regions. Even if that arrangement did not last, it anticipated later reforms that treated the western African coast and southern Spain as parts of a connected zone. Under the Flavian emperors, legal privileges expanded across the peninsula in a broad wave. Many communities received Latin rights, but often in a limited form that still placed them below older, privileged towns. New municipal structures were fixed more clearly, and many towns adopted names that advertised their new status and loyalty. Construction also accelerated. Roads, bridges, and public works appeared in key districts, particularly around major administrative centres and military zones. Some of the most famous monuments traditionally linked to Roman Spain are often assigned to this era, though exact dating can be debated. What matters for the story is that Spain, at this point, still had the wealth and organisational confidence to build on a grand scale. Several key documents from this period reveal how Roman administration actually worked on the ground. In one case, a town was permitted to relocate to a new, more practical site in the plain while keeping its upgraded status and continuing to collect dues recognised under earlier emperors. Other dues could not simply be invented and imposed at will. A higher authority had to hear the matter first. In another set of municipal laws issued for important southern towns, local government was carefully defined. Membership in the local council did not automatically mean full Roman citizenship, but access to the full franchise was opened through holding certain magistracies. Voting rights also show a layered society. Residents from other Latin communities could participate, as could resident Romans, yet those Romans did not automatically enjoy special privileges over local citizens in municipal affairs. At the same time, the provincial elite became increasingly willing to hold officials accountable. Leading figures from Italy and Spain took part in prosecuting a notorious southern governor for corruption, and the trial resulted in exile for some accomplices and the effective end of the main offender, who died before formal punishment could be completed. The proceedings were not always clean, and sensational evidence circulated, but the larger point remained. Senatorial provinces often suffered worse administration than imperial provinces, because the emperor had fewer direct incentives to police abuses in territories left under senatorial control. This imbalance became a quiet fault line in the system. The reign of Trajan, born in the south of Spain, is often seen as the high point of Roman Spain's prosperity. Estimates suggest that population rose dramatically from the late Republican age into the middle of the 2nd century. Mining continued, even if profits were smaller than before. Spanish products circulated widely across the Mediterranean. Most importantly, the municipal system functioned at its most energetic level. Local honours were fiercely pursued, and the winners were expected to repay their communities with public buildings, distributions, and permanent charitable foundations. Monumental construction reached a peak, funded sometimes by emperors, sometimes by individual benefactors, sometimes by whole communities acting together. In the north, one long-term military shift helped lay the foundations for the later importance of a city that grew around a legionary base and carried the legion's name into the future. Under Hadrian, there are signs that the arc may have begun to bend. Spain's remarkable run of literary dominance ended. Writers who once helped define Roman culture now gave way to new centres of talent elsewhere, and the intellectual spotlight of the Western Mediterranean increasingly moved across the strait into North Africa. Hadrian himself was closely tied to Spain by birth and family connections. He invested in his home region, beautifying and enriching it, and presented himself as a restorer of Spanish prosperity. Roads were built, and major religious monuments were repaired, including the great shrine at Tarraco. Honour followed in abundance, and so many statues were erected there that a special official had to be appointed simply to manage them. Yet beneath the celebration, warning signs appeared. Large sums that should have flowed from imperial provinces into the treasury were remitted, a measure that suggests financial strain. Even more telling was a gathering of provincial notables from across Spain held at Tarraco. The very fact of such a convention points to a new confidence, perhaps even a budding sense of collective identity beyond local town loyalties. The meeting also revealed a sharper problem: plans to strengthen coastal defence by replacing voluntary enlistment with forced conscription met resistance, showing how deeply the peninsula's most warlike districts were being drained of young men to fill Roman ranks elsewhere. Unlike earlier centuries, there was no compensating influx of settlers. Legions stationed in Spain were increasingly drawn from Spain itself, and after the Flavian period, the stream of new colonies largely stopped. The outlines of two forces that would later help fracture the empire can already be seen forming in the background. A slow thinning of population in key areas and a steady weakening of local wealth that had once fueled civic life. Marcus Aurelius, like two emperors before him, was not born in Spain, yet his family roots reached back to Baetica. During his reign, the empire's growing strain along distant frontiers finally showed itself inside Iberia. Around the year 170, a large band of raiders from North Africa slipped across the straits. They avoided the main Roman forces that were meant to watch the crossing and struck into Baetica with speed. The damage was serious. Malacca was hit hard and its defences were shattered, while another inland town faced a prolonged siege. Relief came when the governor of Lusitania moved quickly, raised forces and lifted the siege, earning public praise as a restorer of order. At the same time, another Roman commander gathered ships and pushed along the North African coast as far as Tingitana. The raiders, suddenly threatened with having their retreat cut off, withdrew rather than risk being trapped. After this shock, Baetica appears to have been placed more directly under imperial control for a time, and a detachment of the 7th Legion was posted at Italica. Unrest also flared in western districts, suggesting that the crisis had shaken more than one province. Signs of deeper weakness were becoming impossible to ignore. Wealth was concentrating, obligations were rising, and the burdens placed on prosperous citizens were heavy. A striking glimpse of this pressure survives in a decree recorded near Seville, dating from the late 2nd century. It shows the state stepping in to reduce the sums demanded for gladiatorial spectacles, and to limit how much private individuals could be compelled to contribute for public shows. It also ended an arrangement that forced trainers to hand over a large share of their earnings to the treasury. The decree was meant for the whole empire, but only the Spanish copy remains. A reminder that the financial stress behind civic display had become a public problem that even emperors could not ignore. under Commodus, the paralysis creeping into imperial authority became visible in a different form. Wars on northern frontiers and a devastating plague had already weakened the system. In that atmosphere, a single soldier from Italy managed to gather a roaming force of criminals and deserters. This band moved through Gaul and into Spain, plundering, burning, and even besieging towns. What is most revealing is not only the violence, but the lack of an effective response. For a time, these raiders operated with little interference from provincial governors, as if the machinery of control had grown slow, distracted, or simply exhausted. With the end of the Antonine dynasty, a pattern that would repeat for generations began to take hold. Usurpers appeared again and again, men who seized one or more provinces and claimed the imperial title. Their impact was often less disruptive than might be expected because Roman government had become the default operating system of the provinces. Even when a new ruler rose, administration usually continued in familiar form. The same taxes were collected, the same local councils met, and municipal life carried on. These breakaway rulers did not present themselves as champions of local independence. They called themselves Roman emperors, copied Rome's institutions, and often proved capable of defending territory against external threats. Spain itself rarely produced such claimants and remained among the most loyal provinces, though it sometimes had to accept the authority of Western pretenders, whose power base lay in Gaul. A few of these Western rulers imposed themselves on Iberia, and support for them could bring punishment when the central government recovered control. Their regimes still mirrored Rome so closely that they even maintained senates, expanding them with deputies from the provinces they held, including representatives from Spain. Administrative reshaping continued through the early 3rd century. The northwest gained a more distinct provincial identity, reflecting how different that region remained in character and security needs. At roughly the same time, the western part of Mauritania was attached more closely to Iberian administration, an arrangement that recognized the practical links across the western Mediterranean. Then came a sweeping legal change, an imperial decree that extended full citizenship to the free inhabitants of the empire. This is often explained as a way to broaden the tax base by applying citizen-only taxes to everyone. It may also have been driven by a strategic idea. A world facing mounting pressure from outside might stand more firmly if its free populations shared equal legal status, rather than being divided into layers of privilege. The most ominous warning of approaching collapse appeared during the crisis-ridden middle of the 3rd century. Groups identified as Suevi and Franks broke into Spain, pushed deep enough to capture the provincial capital at Taraco, and caused destruction that was remembered long afterward. Other coastal towns also fell into ruin during this period. The invaders were eventually checked by a strong ruler in Gaul, and after years of repeated plunder, they were driven out. But the message was clear. The peninsula was no longer protected by distance, organization, or reputation. It could be reached, wounded, and left scarred. When Diocletian transformed the empire into a far more centralized, tightly controlled system, Spain was affected more by the general shift than by a long list of unique regulations. By this time, Iberia already contained several provinces, and while other regions were carved into many smaller units, the main administrative change was the division of the enormous northern province, with a new southern section organized around a different capital. Later, the Balearic Islands were also treated as a separate unit, bringing the total number of Spanish provinces to a level that would remain stable. All provinces were now under imperial authority. The last visible remnant of senatorial rule disappeared, and provincial governors carried standardized titles, with slight variation in Baetica. Over them stood a vicar managing the whole Spanish diocese from Hispalis, now the largest and most populous city of the peninsula, treated in late Roman imagination as a kind of commanding centre. Above the vicar was the praetorian prefect, responsible for Gaul, who represented the emperor's power across the Western administrative world. The full development of this hierarchical machine belongs especially to the age of Constantine, when the new structure became permanent. The cost of this transformation was immense. The empire now supported a vast class of officials. Local magistrates faced constant interference, and old municipal liberties were steadily hollowed out. What emerged was a uniform landscape of office holders, demanding revenue, taxpayers under pressure, and an expanding population living in conditions close to servitude. In Spain, the economic balance shifted away from the Mediterranean side, toward the south and west, regions that were less exposed to raids and still retained more commercial life. Even there, however, the decay of civic institutions continued. The local senatorial class, once the backbone of municipal pride, became one of the most abused groups. They were held responsible for advancing taxes that they could not reliably collect from neighbours already sliding into poverty. Many were ruined and tried to escape their obligations by flight. Popular election of magistrates faded into formality and then disappeared. Offices were no longer prizes fought over by ambitious citizens. They became burdens imposed on unwilling men. Even minor posts in the imperial bureaucracy offered better prospects than local service, which now carried risk without honour. Meanwhile, local power was weakened further by the appearance of officials who acted as imperial overseers, reducing town autonomy to a shadow. As trade declined, towns began to empty, yet taxes continued to be demanded from them, as if nothing had changed. With fewer residents remaining, the burden per person rose. Guilds that had once strengthened urban life were seized and used as instruments of state extraction. Membership became compulsory and hereditary, and people were locked into trades that they could not abandon. Guild property could be touched by the demands of officials, but could only be enjoyed by those actively practicing the trade. Even if someone managed to escape, rights to that property were lost. In the countryside, a similar process pushed free tenant farmers downward into a condition approaching serfdom, while the weight of taxation fell hardest on those least able to bear it. Artisans disappeared from towns, sometimes by seeking protection through dependence, sometimes by running beyond the frontier. Agricultural land, where it was still cultivated at all, increasingly belonged to office holders and was worked by enslaved labour. Recruitment pools dried up. Spain, long uncomfortable with foreign garrisons, ended up nearly unguarded in the 4th century. Governors were purely civil administrators, and no major military commander was considered necessary, a choice that would later prove disastrous. One towering figure rises from this bleak landscape: Theodosius, remembered as the last great emperor of the Western Empire. Born in the northwest, he belonged to a family tradition linked to the old Romanized elite of the south, and late writers would connect his line to earlier Spanish imperial houses. Under his son Honorius, events unfolded that finally severed Spain from the empire. The trigger came from outside the peninsula. Vandals, Alans, and Sueves surged through frontier defences, defeated Rome's allies, and swept into Gaul, plundering rather than settling. At the same time, a new usurper appeared in Britain and crossed into Gaul, establishing control over a broad corridor of territory and defeating Roman forces. Spain submitted briefly, but powerful local families tied to the imperial house raised forces in Lusitania in support of the legitimate regime. The usurper responded by sending his son to suppress resistance, supported by a hard-driving lieutenant and barbarian auxiliaries. The local imperial supporters were defeated, and a court was set up in a major northeastern city before the commander returned north, leaving his lieutenant in charge. Then the familiar pattern repeated. The lieutenant rebelled, proclaimed his own ruler, and civil conflict deepened. In the struggle for power, the door was open to catastrophe. The Germanic groups in Gaul were invited or encouraged to enter Spain, either to strengthen a faction or to secure an advantage. The lieutenant marched back into Gaul to fight, while the invaders crossed the mountains into the peninsula. By the time the imperial centre reacted and restored order in Gaul, the damage could not be undone. The Germanic peoples were now established in Spain. Only the northeastern corner remained effectively under imperial control by the year 409. What followed was a period of extreme misery. The invaders moved through the land, extracting food and money by force. Few towns could resist for long. Some garrisons were starved into collapse. Hunger reached such a level in places that the most desperate acts were reported. Violence did not come only from foreign armies. Ruined peasants formed bands of brigands and added another layer of terror. In the north and in remote strongholds, older tribal identities reasserted themselves and resisted both Roman authority and new rulers. In the south, communities sheltered in harsh mountain zones remained difficult to subdue even long afterward. Wealthy landowners, abandoned by the state, began to fortify their villas and build private forces, using armed slaves in ways that anticipated later medieval patterns. Eventually, the invaders reached a settlement of sorts with the weakened imperial authorities and divided the peninsula. The Sueves, along with one division of the Vandals, occupied the northwest. The Alans, a steppe people, took Lusitania and broad central zones. The Siling Vandals settled in Baetica, and the later name of that region would echo their presence. Agriculture began to recover slightly, but stability did not last. A new force entered the story: the Visigoths. The early 5th century is difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Several writers describe it, but most were not careful historians, and inscriptions become scarce. The result is a record filled with movements, battles, shifting loyalties, and sudden changes of power. Christian authors condemned the moral state of the age, contrasting Roman luxury with what they imagined as barbarian simplicity. Some even admitted that many provincials had ceased to think of themselves as Romans. Yet the same period also brought an important transformation. Large numbers of non-Christian invaders gradually converted, and this altered the religious landscape of the peninsula in ways that would shape the future. The charge of widespread luxury sits uneasily beside descriptions of starvation, collapse, and social breakdown. A society in which free people were falling into dependence, local elites were fleeing impossible tax burdens, and ordinary provincials were seeking humane treatment. Beyond the frontier is not a society likely to be thriving in indulgence. Spain also lacked the enormous metropolitan centres that elsewhere became symbols of idleness and corruption. When the moral accusations are examined more closely, they often narrow to specific complaints: the survival of certain public entertainments, and the persistence of older seasonal customs. Some towns continued to hold circus games and theatrical shows with reputations for moral damage until new rulers finally suppressed them. Some older festivals also survived, including New Year street rituals in which people wore animal skins and masks and ran through the town in wild celebration. Such practices lingered long after official Roman religion had faded, showing that cultural habits can outlast political systems. What is beyond doubt is that many Spaniards viewed changes of rulers with a weary indifference. For some, life under foreigners seemed preferable to life under a Roman tax regime that felt endless and crushing. That attitude mattered, because it shaped how quickly Roman authority dissolved once it could no longer protect its provinces. The rise of a Visigothic kingdom in Spain is only partially visible through the haze of these decades. From the first Gothic entry early in the 5th century until a later king finally abandoned any pretense of obedience to Rome, the span covers about 60 years. For much of that time, the Goths cooperated with Rome, fighting on its behalf against other barbarian groups in exchange for control of a wealthy kingdom in southern Gaul. In the early phase, the Vandals were the most destructive power in Spain, and their raids reached far across the south and centre. When they departed for Africa in 429, taking with them the remnants of the Alans who had been heavily defeated, the Sueves in the northwest expanded their raids and overran large parts of the country, though without settling permanently everywhere they struck. Outside the Civic Kingdom, much of Spain still existed in a legal fiction as imperial territory, which in practice meant that towns were left largely to themselves, except when mercenary armies briefly appeared. Eventually the Goths pushed deeper. A Gothic king captured the Suevic capital and forced submission, though the Sueves endured as a separate kingdom for a long time afterward. Then a later Gothic ruler drove out the remaining Roman garrisons and broke local resistance in the northeast, bringing almost the whole peninsula under Gothic control except for the Suevic zone and the Balearic Islands, which remained linked to the African Vandals. Not long after, the Goths lost most of their Gallic kingdom to the Franks in a decisive battle near Poitiers. Power shifted south, and the seat of government moved from Toulouse to Toledo in 508. By then, the Western Empire had fallen, and Spain fell with it. Yet the Roman legacy did not vanish. A municipal framework still existed, weakened and impoverished by the late imperial crisis, but capable of revival and well suited to the peninsula's deep local instincts. Latin remained the shared language across most of Iberia, with the notable exception of the Basque-speaking zone. Law and administration left behind a strong foundation. Art and architecture, once highly developed, were now in decline, but their influence remained visible. Above all, one force offered a path toward unity that older tribal politics never achieved: Christianity. By late Roman times, bishops had become the real leaders of many communities, often replacing civil officials as the most stable authority in public life. Under Gothic rule, municipal structures revived in important ways, even as the countryside became more dominant than the city. Local elites were relieved of unbearable burdens, and tax collection was reorganized through officials appointed by Gothic authorities. Town councils were strengthened by being given judicial roles, and Roman law continued with modifications, later shaping medieval legal traditions. A feudal aristocracy under a weak elective monarchy had to contend with a landscape of deeply rooted towns and a powerful church hierarchy supported by ordinary people. In that struggle, Roman political habits and legal ideas often proved stronger than Gothic identity. The Goths gradually lost their language, abandoned their earlier religious divisions, and became absorbed into the peninsula's dominant cultural framework. Their kings gained power against local landowners, only to come increasingly under the influence of church councils. Municipal life persisted. One of the most dramatic second winds of a fading Roman world begins in the 5th century and reaches its brightest moment under Justinian. In those years, the empire, now centred in the east, tried to claw back the western Mediterranean. Italy was fought over and partially recovered from the Goths, and the Vandal kingdom in North Africa was crushed so completely that its power disappeared almost overnight. The recovery was never total. Much of Mauritania remained beyond firm control, held by local tribes who resisted any long-term restoration. Even so, the empire maintained a handful of exposed posts on the African edge of the straits, outposts meant to guard sea lanes and keep a foothold near Iberia. At one such place near Ceuta, imperial troops held their ground even when a Visigothic army from Spain attempted to drive them out. This new push westward was driven by more than pride. The Eastern emperors wanted to restore influence in the Mediterranean, and they also wanted security for Africa, which still mattered financially and strategically. That combination of ambition and necessity led to a remarkable decision. After nearly 800 years, imperial leaders again looked towards Spain, imagining not only conquest but liberation from Gothic rule. The plan was not entirely unrealistic. The Visigothic ruling class still followed a form of Christianity that most Spaniards considered heretical, while the majority of the local population, especially in the south, was intensely Catholic. Bishops in many cities favoured imperial intervention, and a number of Andalusian towns calculated that a distant emperor in Constantinople might allow more breathing space than a powerful court in Toledo, whose reach could feel immediate and heavy. The spark came from Cordova, a proud and influential city with a strong civic tradition. A Gothic king managed to turn the population against him by offending local religious sentiment and provoking outrage at a revered shrine. A revolt erupted, forcing the king to retreat to Merida. At the head of the Catholic rising stood a Gothic noble, Athanagild, a man with his own ambitions. He opened negotiations with the empire and offered a bargain: military help in exchange for territory in the south, parts of Andalusia and sections of Murcia. Constantinople accepted the offer quickly. Imperial troops crossed the straits under a senior commander and coordinated with the rebels. A royal force sent to crush the movement was defeated near Seville. The Gothic king was then killed by his own followers, who feared that civil war was opening the door to a full Roman return. Athanagild took the throne, tried to calm the kingdom, and crucially left the imperial troops in possession of the towns that had already been handed over. Once established, imperial commanders tested the limits. They attempted to expand beyond the agreed zone. Some places could not be held. Seville was abandoned. But other cities resisted pressure and remained in the imperial orbit. Cordova, in particular, held out successfully against efforts to dislodge the Romans, and later, political confusion allowed the imperial enclave to widen. At its greatest, the Roman zone stretched along a long belt of southern coastline from the far southwest toward the southeast, reaching past Cartagena, while also holding the Balearic Islands, which had shifted back into imperial hands earlier after Vandal power collapsed. Church organization in the islands remained linked to older Mediterranean structures, a reminder that these territories still belonged to a wider world of sea routes and episcopal networks, even as the peninsula itself was drifting away from the empire. The imperial footprint in Spain was real but limited, concentrated in a few strong points. Cordova, Cartagena, and Malaga stood out as major centres, with Malaga serving as a valuable harbour for trade with Italy. Another key town in the zone acted as a strategic anchor in the south. Daily life did not transform overnight. Old municipal habits seemed to have continued, and for many residents, the change of flag meant new garrisons more than new institutions. Military administration was layered. A chief commander oversaw the Spanish enclave, supported by local dukes in important cities like Malaga, while headquarters shifted between Cordova and Cartagena, depending on security needs. The Spanish enclave was also tied tightly to Africa. In the later 6th century, the remnants of imperial territory in Mauritania and the Spanish possessions were grouped into a broader administrative unit. In practice, this meant that Spain's imperial commanders worked under the wider authority based at Carthage in Africa, which handled both civil and military priorities. Despite alliances and shared religion, the empire never pushed far inland. Relations with the Catholic Civic Kingdom in Galicia and with the Franks could be friendly, and these connections sometimes acted as a buffer against the Goths. Yet most Spaniards had long memories. Earlier Roman taxation had been oppressive, and the late empire's burdens had left scars. That history did not encourage enthusiasm for a restored imperial fiscal system. The garrisons themselves were often composed of soldiers drawn from distant regions, men with little cultural connection to Andalusian citizens or peasants. Chroniclers describe these troops in broad, vague terms, suggesting they were seen as outsiders, a necessary shield, but not a natural part of the local world. Everything changed when a strong Visigothic king, Leovigild, came to power. His reign marks the moment the Roman comeback began to shrink. In the late 560s, imperial forces suffered defeats and several towns in Mercia were recovered by the Goths. Malaga, protected by strong walls, appears to have resisted longer than expected. But one important southern town was lost through betrayal, and soon afterward, Cordova itself, the great symbol of the imperial position, was besieged. Local countryside forces tried to help the city, but the outcome was brutal. The city was taken by surprise at night. Its garrison was slaughtered, and other smaller places defended by local levies were absorbed back into Gothic control. With Cordova gone, the imperial centre of gravity shifted east to Cartagena, and the Spanish enclave became a coastal fragment, rather than a coherent southern province. Even then, the end did not come immediately, partly because the Gothic kingdom itself fractured. Leovigild's son Hermenegild rebelled. He had Catholic sympathies and political ambition, and he allied himself with both the Empire and the Sueves. Southern cities declared for him. Seville became his court, and Cordova invited an imperial garrison back into its walls. Yet Constantinople could not send the kind of support that would make this rebellion decisive. Leovigild tightened the net. The Suevic army that tried to relieve Seville was defeated. Seville was pushed into famine. Control of the Guadalquivir was used as a weapon, and the ruins of old Roman sites nearby were fortified to strengthen the blockade. Hermenegild escaped to Cordova, but the city and prince were betrayed, and he was exiled. A leading Catholic bishop who had supported the rebel was driven out and appealed to the emperor, but intervention came too late. Hermenegild was killed, and centuries later Catholic memory would treat him as a martyr figure, blending politics, rebellion and religious identity into a single dramatic narrative. Leovigild exploited his victory to reshape the map. The Roman possessions were split into separated pockets, southwest and southeast, with the heart of Andalusia, Seville and Cordova permanently secured for the Goths. He also absorbed the Civic Kingdom and forced stubborn mountain peoples into obedience. Even the symbolism of sovereignty changed. Visigothic coinage stopped borrowing the emperor's name and began to speak in a language of independent rule, a small but telling sign that the Goths were no longer pretending to be junior partners in a Roman world. His successor, Reccared, moved in a different direction. He abandoned the Arian tradition and adopted Catholic Christianity, a decision that changed the internal logic of the struggle. Once the Gothic court and the Spanish church aligned, the bishops of the imperial zone faced an uncomfortable choice. Loyalty to Constantinople began to look less like loyalty to the faith and more like separation from the national councils that now guided Spanish Catholic life. In this period, the imperial governor at Cartagena carried out building works and left inscriptions that praise his rule in grand language. Yet church writers accused him of heavy-handed interference, including disputes around bishops and church property. The tension reveals an important shift. As Gothic Spain became Catholic, the empire lost one of its greatest advantages in the peninsula: the ability to present itself as the protector of the true faith. By the early 7th century, the imperial enclave was sliding toward extinction. A Gothic king recovered only a small fortified point near the straits after repeated campaigning, but the wider trend was clear. Then a more energetic ruler, Sigebert, came to the throne at a moment when the Eastern Empire was stretched thin by wars against Avars and Persians. He moved decisively. Cities east of the straits were captured one by one, and their walls were torn down, ensuring they could not easily return to imperial hands. Surviving letters from this time show desperate negotiations between the Gothic court and imperial officials. Constantinople, recognizing that it could not defend Spain, agreed to give up nearly all remaining territory, keeping only a few outposts in the far southwest for a short time. Alongside these military events, another harsh episode unfolded that reflects how fear and policy could collide. Imperial circles were haunted by prophecies and anxieties about the empire's enemies, and such fears were sometimes projected onto minority communities. In Spain, under a Gothic government now closely guided by Catholic clergy, persecution intensified and forced conversions were carried out on a large scale. Many fled, losing property and security, scattering into neighbouring lands. These movements would matter later, because displaced communities do not forget, and networks across the Western Mediterranean could become channels of information and revenge. Sigebert's campaigns left him master of almost all Spain. A later king completed the work in the 620s, defeating the last imperial commanders and persuading others to defect. The remaining garrisons boarded ships and sailed east, leaving the peninsula entirely outside imperial control. Even then, the eastern emperors struggled to accept the loss. Long after the western provinces had vanished, and even after the empire had begun losing major lands elsewhere, naval expeditions were still sent towards Spain in hopes of reopening the door. They failed, turned back by Spanish defense. But the attempt itself shows how deeply the old Roman imagination was tied to the idea of Iberia as a western anchor of the Mediterranean world. Once the empire was gone, Spain would not return to an imperial structure of that kind again, except in a very different form many centuries later, when dynastic politics briefly revived the old word, empire, in a new European setting. That later connection brought Spain into conflicts far from its own interests and never produced a popular desire for permanent union. The peninsula's fate was moving in another direction, towards struggles that would be decided not by Constantinople, but by new powers rising out of North Africa and the Western Mediterranean. For the earlier centuries, before Rome ever conquered Spain, information is uneven and often filtered through outsiders. Greek and Roman writers describe the peninsula as a mosaic of peoples, and later, authors repeat older reports, sometimes mixing observation with legend. Some sources are colourful rather than reliable, arranging the tribes into dramatic lists, as if the peninsula were a stage for epic poetry. Still, even through exaggeration, certain patterns are visible. Many observers describe Iberians as serious and stubborn, not given to frivolity, yet intensely proud. They are pictured as preferring action to wandering talk, moving with purpose, toward hunting or war. Roman writers also note a restless curiosity and a taste for novelty, qualities that can coexist with conservatism when a society is fiercely local but eager for personal distinction. Again and again, ancient authors stress a striking attitude toward death. In parts of Celtiberia, dying in battle was treated as honourable, while dying peacefully could be portrayed as shameful. Suicide is mentioned as a chosen escape from dishonor. Whatever the exact accuracy of these reports, the ideal behind them is clear. A belief that the highest form of life is a life proved under pressure, and that personal dignity can outweigh survival itself. This mentality echoes later in Spanish religious history, where martyrdom becomes a powerful cultural ideal. The willingness of certain victims to provoke death by open defiance is one expression of the same underlying pattern. An exaltation of sacrifice and an insistence on the value of individual resolve. Duels and single combats also appear frequently in the old descriptions. Enemy leaders were challenged directly. Volunteers stepped forward for lethal displays of courage. Some tribes maintained elite bands bound to a chief by oath, pledged not to outlive him, living as a personal guard and dying with him if necessary. Names linked to such institutions appear in later inscriptions from the north, suggesting that this kind of sworn companionship was not only a literary motif but a real social pattern. This devotion to an ideal, whether a leader, a cause, or a sacred principle, helps explain why Spain could swing between fierce resistance and sudden collapse. The same energy that produces heroic last stands can also fuel persecution, fanaticism, and uncompromising zeal. Later centuries would show both faces. Intellectual life also reflects this tension. Stoicism, with its stress on the dignity of the individual under oppression, found followers among great minds. At the same time, religious systems perceived as reducing personal agency could be rejected with unusual force. Catholicism, with its emphasis on moral choice and communal faith, eventually became the dominant banner, especially once Gothic rulers moved into that orbit. Politically, much of pre-Roman Spain was organized around local aristocracies, rather than unified kingdoms. Councils of nobles decided questions of war and peace. Some towns had chief magistrates. Other regions had kings whose authority was limited, often more like a war leader than a centralized monarch. Rule might pass among a ruler's sons in a rotating pattern rather than by strict primogeniture. In the east, powerful towns dominated surrounding minor places, and urban life could be impressive. Thick walls with towers, a citadel, and open spaces near the defences. Even groups often imagined as purely pastoral adopted town life in Iberia, adapting to a landscape where fortified settlements offered security and status. Patriotism was real, but its focus was local. Loyalty centered on the town rather than the nation, and often even more than the tribe. There was no single religious hierarchy that could unify the peninsula, and no strong military structure that could coordinate large regions. No dominant city or kingdom emerged early enough to weld the rest into a stable whole. The result was vulnerability. Invaders could defeat communities one by one, because the peninsula struggled to act as a single body. Yet once a city was cornered in its own stronghold, resistance could become astonishingly intense. Famous cases of collective endurance and destruction were repeated across centuries, and the pattern did not die with antiquity. Warfare in Spain is repeatedly described as something that flares up suddenly, spreads rapidly, and refuses to burn out, like a fire rekindled by wind. Ancient writers also describe extremes that appear whenever siege and hunger break societies to the edge. Desperate acts when supplies vanish, prisoners who refuse humiliation even under torture, communities that choose burning themselves and their property rather than surrender. At the same time, those same sources sometimes claim that Spanish warfare could be less cruel than that of other invading peoples, noting moments when defeated enemies were released rather than slaughtered. Whether that contrast is idealized or not, it points to a complicated reality. Brutality under pressure but not always a culture built on cruelty for its own sake. In the long wars of the late Republic, even Roman writers admit that the worst atrocities were often committed by Roman armies. An admission that underlines how conquest can brutalize both sides, and how the historical record, even when biased, sometimes exposes uncomfortable truths. Tough, athletic, and deeply adapted to a hard landscape, many Iberian communities produced fighters who seemed made for irregular war. They could ride well, move fast, and survive on little, which gave them a natural advantage in ambushes, raids, and sudden strikes from hills and forests. What stands out in the ancient descriptions is that these traits were not limited to men. Women are repeatedly portrayed as sharing the same endurance and resolve. In battle, some fought alongside husbands, or joined the defense when towns were attacked. In certain districts, daily farming work also leaned heavily on women's labour, and the home was not described as a passive space. It was a place where discipline, memory, and identity were passed down. Polygamy does not appear as a normal institution in these accounts. Instead, mothers are shown teaching children and preparing young men for war, even reciting stories of ancestors before sons marched out, as if military tradition were preserved not only by chiefs, but by family voices. The darker edge of this image is equally clear. When defeat threatened, some women were said to have killed their own children, rather than let them be captured. That kind of story may be shaped by ancient taste for dramatic examples, but it reflects a real theme in the sources: the belief that dishonour and enslavement could be worse than death. A few customs also hint at older social patterns that did not fit later Roman expectations. In parts of the northwest, marriage arrangements sometimes seem to reverse what Mediterranean societies considered normal. Men might give dowries, daughters might inherit, and brothers could receive marriage portions through their sisters. Whether this points to an earlier matrilineal tradition or to local variations in property and kinship, the impression is of a world where women could hold recognized status within family structure. Even in everyday life, there are glimpses of public attention to women's work. Some groups are described as formally judging textile production each year and rewarding the most industrious, which suggests that weaving was not only household labour but a measurable source of prestige. Slavery, in these descriptions, existed but did not dominate most rural societies before Rome, outside the bigger commercial centres. In large towns, the numbers were higher, but among many tribes, slaves are presented as relatively few, at least compared with later imperial patterns. Clothing and appearance also mark cultural distance. A thick, shaggy wool cloak was common, usually dark and sometimes hooded, fastened with metal buckles. Among inland peoples, headgear could be decorated with feathers or crests, and narrow trousers appear frequently. Over time, as Roman control spread, these older styles faded in many places and Roman fashions became normal, but earlier sources emphasize how distinctive local dress once looked. Status was worn on the body. Leaders could be recognized by bracelets and heavy collars of precious metal. Some of these collars were plain, others were elaborately worked or shaped like twisted rope. An example survived long enough to be recovered centuries later from Western Spain and Portugal. Women's clothing is described with even more visual detail. Bright robes contrasted with dark hanging veils, sometimes with iron neck rings, and unusual headdresses with curved rods rising above the head. One writer even claims that women took pride in tightly cinched waist belts, a small observation that reveals how outsiders often focused on visual markers when trying to define a people. In remoter areas, skins could replace woven cloth, and in the islands off the east coast, a skin cloak with the hair left on it is described as a normal garment. Even heralds might wear animal skins as part of their insignia, a reminder that symbols of authority could still be rooted in hunting culture. Military reputation, however, was the central theme. With the exception of the most commercial and urbanized groups in the south, most Iberian peoples were credited with excellence in war, especially in the kind of fighting that breaks formations and punishes slow armies. The terrain amplified this. Mountains, ravines, wooded slopes, and narrow passes allowed small bands to harass disciplined troops, vanish, and strike again. This pattern did not end with antiquity. Later centuries in Spain repeatedly produced the same kind of resistance. Local fighters using landscape, speed, and surprise to bleed larger forces. Roman commanders learned quickly. Tactics were copied, and even certain weapons became Roman standard once their effectiveness was proven. In set-piece battles, the most feared warriors were often those of the Celtiberian interior. They are described forming a wedge to punch through an enemy line at a chosen point, using shock rather than long exchanges. Their equipment shows a blend of local and wider Celtic influence. Long spears with iron tips, short stabbing swords with sharp points that Romans later adopted, and large shields associated with Celtic styles. Another sword type is described with a curved blade that cut on the inner curve, built for slashing, and it appears as a specifically Spanish form in several accounts. Northern mountain groups had a different reputation. Some are described as strong-built and fond of heavy weapons like axes, but also as often lightly equipped for the realities of their terrain. Small shields of woven material covered in hide, javelins, slings, and bows. Small figures and reliefs from the imperial era even show auxiliaries wearing neck collars and carrying compact round shields, visual echoes of older tribal gear now absorbed into Roman service. Cavalry stands out across the west and north. Certain regions were famous for horse breeding, producing small, tough mounts, valued even outside Spain. Riders from these districts became known for rapid charges and agile maneuvers. One technique, later described in Roman military writing, involved horsemen wheeling past enemy ranks at speed. Each rider targeting a specific opponent and trying to punch a light spear through shield and armor in a single pass. It was not just about impact, but about rhythm, motion, and nerve. Other details underline how trained these horses were said to be. Climbing steep slopes, dropping to their knees on command, and moving as if they were part of the fighter's body, rather than a separate animal. These horsemen did not always fight as pure cavalry. Mixed tactics appear often. Riders might arrive with a partner, one staying mounted while the other dismounted to fight, effectively creating a small mobile unit that could adapt instantly. Western fighters are portrayed with a theatrical edge too, charging with hair loose, shouting, and then withdrawing just as quickly, refusing to hold formation for long. That refusal was not weakness, it was strategy. Ambush, sudden retreat, and repeated return attacks could exhaust an enemy who expected a single, decisive clash. Equipment matched this style. Smaller shields hung from straps, light greaves and helmets made from tough materials, breast protection that might be chain but more often linen, and a preference for barbed javelins and slings. Even the cultural side of war is noted. Some groups advanced in rhythm, singing war chants, and in peacetime practiced dances that trained agility and leg strength. Wealthy warriors added display to function. Linen tunics with coloured borders on campaign. Bronze helmets with multiple crests and other details meant to be seen. Against this wider background, the southwestern Tartessian world, later described under different names, is repeatedly singled out as the most civilized and least warlike. By the early imperial period, many communities there were already deeply Romanized. Latin speech was common, Old local languages had faded, and legal and civic forms looked increasingly Roman. Ancient writers attribute to them a literary tradition, records, poems, and even laws set in verse, whose claimed age is clearly exaggerated, but still points to a sense of long cultural memory. Their religion is described with strong astral themes, with important shrines linked to the sun and the dawn. The picture that emerges is of a wealthy trading society with refined habits and deep local pride, but one that struggled to resist aggressive invaders. It is one of the oldest patterns in Mediterranean history. Commerce builds richness, but mobile raiders and military states often decide the political future. North of this refined zone, other Celtic groups appear as more village-based, less urban, and culturally distinct in worship and language. Beyond them, the Western Lusitanians are described as both feared and difficult to govern. People living in a land of fertility and minerals, yet often choosing raiding and war over settled farming. Rome's long-term solution, when conquest finally came, was not simply to fight them in the hills. It was to reshape their lives, move communities into plains, break up fortified centres, and introduce outside settlers and garrisons to hold key points. Even then, the sources emphasise how hard it was to reach mountain refuges where raiders could vanish beyond the reach of heavy infantry. This is paired with details of harsh lifestyle. Simple food, cold baths, and a kind of vapour bath created with heated stones, suggesting a society hardened by routine as much as by conflict. In the far west and northwest, the accounts paint an even more primitive picture. Though it is clear that Roman influence later pulled some of these districts toward mining. Certain groups are described practicing augury and performing armed dances, striking shields as part of ritual and training. Others, like the Vascones, are portrayed in harsh language by later Christian writers, who imply older practices such as human sacrifice and emphasize their wildness. Some claims, like cannibalism, appear in moralizing contexts and may reflect prejudice or isolated events magnified into stereotypes. Yet even biased reports show the same underlying contrast. Fierce warlike reputation combined with limited urban and industrial development in certain upland zones. Everyday life, when the sources step away from battle, looks austere. One meal a day is mentioned, along with water drinking, even when clothing is described as rich. Alcohol existed, though, in forms suited to the land: beer, cider, and herbal spirits. Where olives and vines were rare away from the Mediterranean, butter could replace oil. Acorns could be ground into flour, an old survival practice in marginal landscapes. Sleeping arrangements are described as simple, often wrapped in the same cloak worn during the day. At meals, guests might sit around the walls in a strict order of age and rank, while food was carried around. Sports appear as popular social rituals: boxing, races, and equestrian contests. Music and dance are described in feasting scenes, with leaping movements that trained spring and balance, as if celebration itself doubled as physical conditioning. Economic exchange could also be improvised. In places without coinage, trade might be barter, or pieces of silver could be cut and weighed as a substitute currency. Justice in these descriptions could be severe. Criminals thrown from rocks, parricides stoned outside town boundaries. Some travel writers include strange anecdotes, like sick people being left by the road to ask advice from passers-by who had suffered the same illness. That kind of detail often sounds like a visitor turning a single scene into a general rule. But it still suggests how much ancient observers relied on anecdote to define unfamiliar societies. On the wet western coasts, small boats of hide or canoes, cut from one trunk, are mentioned, a practical response to marshes, estuaries, and difficult shorelines. The Celtiberians of the centre are often described with a particular tone: proud, self-contained, disciplined, and intensely confident. Hospitality is praised, but so is harshness toward enemies and criminals. They traded enough to acquire imported wine, sometimes blending it into drinks like mead, but their defining craft was weapons. Certain towns became famous for forging blades, and the quality of their arms was treated as exceptional. In war, they relied on the wedge attack and had a reputation for an almost unstoppable initial rush, unless met by cavalry at the right moment. Nearby peoples are described sharing related customs, including unusual land systems, where fields were redistributed periodically, reflecting a view that land was a communal resource while movable goods carried the main idea of private property. Some writers claim that harvests were divided equally with death as punishment for cheating, an extreme detail that may be exaggerated, but it still points to social rules meant to prevent wealthy individuals from permanently monopolizing the soil. Off the coast, the Balearic Islands add a different layer. Their population is described as Iberian in broad terms, but archaeology shows older, distinct prehistoric building traditions: towers, stone huts, and tombs built from large blocks. Greeks had a light presence and tended to mix with natives rather than dominate. Later, Carthaginian influence was stronger, especially in trade and coinage, with coastal settlements shaped by Punic language and religion. Over time, Roman power arrived as well. The islanders gained a notorious reputation for piracy, which eventually prompted a Roman campaign. Naval strength and heavy infantry proved decisive, and after resistance was broken in the hills, settlers were brought in to stabilize and civilize the islands. Roman-style towns were founded, local communities were reorganized, and the islands were gradually pulled into the economic orbit of the empire. What the Balearics were truly famous for, though, was not piracy but slings. Their slingers were treated as elite specialists, hired by both Carthage and Rome. The accounts describe them carrying multiple slings at once and striking with such accuracy that defenders on walls could be picked off at range, helmets dented, shields shattered. Training was said to begin in childhood, and one story, repeated because it is memorable, imagines mothers refusing bread until a boy hit his target. Whether literal or not, it captures how outsiders explained skill. Not as talent alone, but as discipline, forced by harsh upbringing. Under Roman rule, these islanders gradually adopted more standard clothing and integrated into Mediterranean commerce, becoming, in time, as urban and civilized as many coastal Spaniards. From the moment Mediterranean sailors learned what lay beyond the western horizon, the Iberian Peninsula gained a reputation that never really faded. It was the place where metal seemed to rise out of the ground. Long before Rome became an empire, Phoenician traders were already moving Spanish gold and silver eastward, exchanging it for manufactured goods and luxury items. Later, Carthage drew heavily on the same reserves, and when Rome finally wrested control of Iberia, these mines and metal routes became one of the quiet engines powering Roman expansion. Ancient writers, even those speaking from far away, treated Spain as a treasury for the entire known world, an exceptional land whose streams, hills, and rocky veins promised wealth on a scale that sounded almost mythical. Yet the fascination was never only about glittering treasure. Roman administrators and practical observers, people who had actually governed in Spain, inspected estates, and watched merchants load ships, describe a country of strong agricultural potential and rich coastal waters. The south and east, when carefully farmed, could be intensely productive, with broad grazing lands supporting flocks whose wool became one of the peninsula's most valuable exports. Along those same shores, tuna and conger were caught in large numbers, processed, and shipped out by organised firms that treated fish not as a local food, but as an international commodity. Even inland districts that looked less fertile had their own value: esparto grass, flax, timber in certain zones, and above all a wide spread of mineral deposits: gold, silver, copper, lead, iron, and many stones prized for carving or jewellery. Sheep and wool became a kind of signature of Roman Spain. The finest animals were especially associated with the southern province, later called Baetica, and with communities in the western interior. Their wool was not just plentiful, but carefully managed. Herds could be shorn twice a year, and ancient agricultural writers show an almost obsessive attention to fleece, colour, and texture. Sheep were sometimes kept under protective coverings to influence the shade and quality of the wool. Fleeces could be naturally pale, yellowish, grey, or black, and breeders experimented constantly, even trying to set a colour into a line of animals as if tone itself were an inheritance to be engineered. Exotic breeding attempts were also part of the story. Foreign rams brought in as curiosities could end up being used to strengthen local stock, producing animals valued not only for quantity, but for the precise look of their fleece. In the early imperial period, finished textiles moved to Italy. Later, raw wool increasingly became the export, feeding Mediterranean industries that wanted Spanish material more than Spanish workmanship. The animal world described for Iberia is strikingly varied. In some regions, mouflon-like animals existed with hair rather than classic wool. Elsewhere, wild goats were said to be numerous enough that their hair could be woven into tough garments suited to sailors and soldiers. Horses were equally important, both economically and culturally. Writers talk about herds running over open plains, and they praise the riding qualities of certain regional breeds. Small but swift animals used for fast travel and valued far beyond Spain's borders. In forested areas, hunting mattered more than outsiders sometimes expect. Deer and large boar were common enough to shape local diets and local symbols, and cured hams became a source of profit in parts of the Pyrenean foothills. The boar appears repeatedly in regional imagery, suggesting how strongly the animal was linked with status, identity, and the idea of the hunt. Water resources added another layer. Large rivers provided abundant fish, and the coasts, especially in the south and east, supported major fisheries. In some towns, the sea trade was so central that fish imagery became an emblem of local identity. Fishing could also mean risk and distance. Sailors from the far south were said to push down the Atlantic coast of Africa or far into open water, treating the ocean as a working space rather than a barrier. Shellfish and certain prized species were noted as common, and the preservation industry became immense. Coastal sites developed large tanks and reservoirs to hold tuna and mackerel, destined for salting and export, linking Iberian shorelines directly to Italian markets. In northern waterways, even animals like beavers were present in sufficient numbers to be exploited for substances used in medicine and craft. Across all this abundance, grain remained the foundation. Wheat and other cereals were cultivated widely, not only in the south, but also across the great interior plains. Rome's interests were practical and relentless. A set fraction of the harvest could be demanded as tribute, and beyond that, merchants and state agents gathered even more for export. The grain trade was not a casual flow of surplus. It was organized at scale, with shipping firms, overseers, and routes so regular that Spanish cargoes became a familiar element in the ports serving Italy. Storage techniques matched the need. In some areas, grain was kept in underground chambers or simple dry trenches, sometimes stored while still in the ear. and the idea that grain could be preserved for decades in sealed spaces remained part of Iberian rural practice long after antiquity. Local tastes did not always match Roman ones. Some sources suggest that many native communities did not consume much wine in earlier periods, and that imported wine could be relatively costly compared to local staples. Yet vines were cultivated, and viticulture adapted to heat and dryness. Grapes could be managed low to the ground to avoid shading neighbouring plants, and in extreme sun they might be protected with leaves. Must and grapes were stored in clay jars sealed against spoilage. Over time, as Italian agriculture weakened and demand rose, wines from Spain and Gaul became more common in wider Mediterranean circulation. Not all of it was celebrated as fine, but the trade itself shows how Spain's agricultural output could move from regional consumption to imperial scale exchange. Olives and oil became another major pillar, especially in the south. Ancient observers praised the quality of certain oils and described production methods in a way that reveals how standardized and commercialized the process became. Oil was not merely a food, it was an export, a commodity for cooking, lighting, and even medical use. Alongside oil, fibers mattered. Flax was produced in multiple provinces and developed into a specialized manufacture in certain towns whose linen became famous for fine cloth used in veils, nets, and sails. The relationship between flax and maritime life was direct. Strong linen meant better rigging and faster voyages, tightening the links between Spain and Italy. Esparto grass, meanwhile, became the working material of the countryside and the sea. It could be turned into bedding, shoes, torches, ropes, and ship rigging. Harvesting it was difficult, requiring protective gear and long processing, bundling, drying, soaking, and drying again before it could become usable fibre. What looks like humble grass in the hills becomes, in an imperial economy, a strategic resource for shipping and trade. The landscape also supplied dyes, timber, and smaller specialized products. In northern districts, forests produced building materials and fuel, and some islands were known for pines. In the southeast, dried figs could be exported, while certain oaks carried growths that yielded a brilliant red dye used for textiles and other goods. Dyers and colour workers appear frequently in inscriptions, a reminder that making cloth was not only about wool and weaving, but about the visual identity of colour, who could afford it, who produced it, and how it moved through markets. Medicinal plants were also gathered and cultivated, and some regional herbs gained a reputation strong enough to travel through the empire as named remedies. All of this output, grain, oil, fish products, wool, fibre, dyes, timber, and metal, generated wealth on an enormous scale, even when provincial administration could be corrupt and extraction-heavy. It also shaped urban life. Spanish towns formed export associations and maintained business operations in Rome itself. Warehouses, counting houses, patrons, and networks. Large dockyards existed in key ports. Ships moved continually, not only through the Mediterranean but along Atlantic routes as well. And in wartime, the state could seize merchant vessels for transport. Overseas traders followed opportunity. Jewish communities are attested early, and merchants from the eastern Mediterranean settled in coastal cities, forming associations that looked like organized commercial communities, rather than isolated foreigners. Behind the agricultural and maritime wealth stood the older legend, Spain's metals. Greek and Near Eastern traditions turned Iberia into a place of rivers lined with silver and hills filled with treasure. Some of this language is poetic exaggeration, but archaeology and early finds support a basic fact. Precious metal was accessible in ways unusual for much of the ancient world. In certain areas, small nuggets could appear near the surface, and even communities without sophisticated smelting could gather and shape native metal using simple tools. Such easily collected material likely entered early trade networks long before large-scale mining methods arrived. Ancient writers also preserve a dramatic explanation for why metal seemed to appear so freely. They imagined a great fire consuming forests and melting ore in the mountains, with rivers then carrying it down and depositing it in plains. The story is mythical in form, but it may echo real landscape events, large fires, erosion, and visible deposits that made the metal country reputation believable. As mining developed, it became more organised and more brutal. Under the Roman Republic, many mines were treated as public assets, leased out to individuals, municipalities, or companies for fixed rents. Over time, emperors worked to bring more mines under direct imperial control, whether through confiscation, inheritance, or political pressure. Not every mine mattered equally. Silver production, for example, could decline in productivity, making private ownership more tolerable. Certain special mines, like those producing cinnabar used for vivid red pigment, were valuable enough to be closely controlled under specific arrangements. Imperial administration typically relied on leasing operations to contractors, while keeping oversight through officials responsible for whole mining districts. Some mining sites were so remote that their attached settlements never developed full civic life. They became functional communities built around extraction. Workers, guards, tradesmen, and officials rather than stable municipal citizens. In these places, services could be treated almost like state-run monopolies. Essential trades might be auctioned out to the highest bidder, turning barbers, teachers, tax collectors, and bath management into regulated concessions. Even bathing could be structured by rules. Certain groups, imperial personnel, soldiers, children, could be admitted freely while fixed fees applied to others. The mining labour force itself fell into stark categories. Poor free workers who chose the work, enslaved labour, and convicts. The last two were often chained. Mines were dangerous, and authorities feared rebellion, so soldiers were commonly stationed nearby. The physical process of mining, as described, was labour-intensive and technically demanding. Shafts could be cut into hillsides and extended long distances through straight or winding galleries. Sometimes pillars were left to hold roofs temporarily, later allowed to collapse to expose ore, a brutal shortcut that traded safety for access. Water was a constant enemy. Underground streams could flood tunnels, and draining required pumps and engines of the sort ancient writers loved to attribute to famous inventors. Walls might be coated to reduce collapse. None of this prevented high death rates. In an age without modern sanitation and with abundant coerced labour, the loss of life could be treated as a cost of extraction. Even so, occasional finds suggest that not every worker was chained or treated identically. Reliefs and objects recovered from mining areas show organised teams, with tools and lamps supervised rather than simply driven. Gold came from two main zones: the northern mountains and certain low sandy districts in the south, where streams could be diverted and sands washed. Gold often appeared as grains, sometimes as larger pieces, and multiple methods existed for separating it: burning and washing sediments, using sieves, experimenting with plant ashes, or simply repeated shaking and rinsing. Northern production is described as once enormous, though yields fell as easier deposits were exhausted and technology reached its limits. Later, imperial gold increasingly came from other conquered regions, showing how the centre of gravity in Roman mining could shift with political expansion. Silver mining, especially in earlier centuries, is described on a scale that sounds almost unbelievable. Certain southern mines employed tens of thousands of workers, cutting into mountains with iron tools. Some mines in the northeast were remembered in local place names, connected to Carthaginian activity, showing how mining history could imprint itself into geography. Alongside silver, electrum appeared in certain regions, a natural mix of gold and silver that could contain unusually high gold content. Copper, by contrast, was a steadier and more widespread industry under the empire. Evidence suggests very early familiarity with copper picking from naturally pure nodules, long before true smelting became common. Under Rome, copper districts supplied huge quantities, shipped through organized port systems, and used in coinage alloys that shaped the everyday economy of the empire. Lead came from several regions and could appear in more than one form, and municipal communities might receive land under the condition that they worked lead sources for the state. Tin added another long-distance thread. It was essential for bronze production and was associated with Atlantic routes and Western trade mysteries. Ancient geographers placed tin islands somewhere beyond Spain's western seas, and later debates tried to identify them in different parts of the Atlantic world. Whatever the precise geography, the key point is that tin was part of a far-reaching network linking Western Europe, coastal traders, and Mediterranean demand. Iberian ports and merchant systems served as middle points in a chain that connected distant sources to southern markets. Cinnabar, used to create vermilion, shows how tightly controlled a single product could be. The pigment was prized for paint and cosmetics, and shipments could be sealed, shipped unprocessed, and handled through central facilities in Rome. Official pricing existed, yet profits could still be inflated by adulteration. A reminder that regulation did not eliminate fraud in high-value trade. Iron, however, may have been the metal most closely associated with local expertise. Northern and central districts produced iron, and certain towns became famous for blade work. Techniques for tempering and selecting the hardest metal-created swords admired across the Roman world, and craft guilds appear in inscriptions showing organized professional identity in metalworking. Beyond metals lay a whole cabinet of mineral products: pigments, salts, crystals, building stones, decorative marbles and gemstones used for engraving and jewellery. Quarries in the peninsula supplied stone for monuments, and certain local marbles later gained their own historical afterlives in medieval construction. Jasper, agate, garnet, and carnelian appear repeatedly in the record, and the idea of Spain as a land of sparkling stones was not merely literary flourish. It reflected a real spread of workable minerals that fed both craft and status. When all of these resources are put together, a pattern becomes clear. Spain's wealth did not rest on a single miracle mine or a single crop. It was a layered economy: flocks and wool, grain and oil, fish and salt tanks, flax and esparto, timber and dyes, then a deep mineral base that drew outsiders for centuries. That breadth explains why so many powers, Phoenician, Carthaginian, Roman, returned again and again to Iberia, not simply to conquer territory, but to secure production. It also explains the later decline that begins to show in the imperial period. Exhausted deposits, heavier taxation, and less secure routes could erode even a rich system. A land can be naturally abundant and still become strained when extraction grows too intense and the wider world grows less stable. Spain's long fame as the metal country survived, but the conditions that once made that fame an engine of empire could not remain permanent.